Our next speaker is Professor Richard Falk, who was a professor for a long time, the Milbank professor at Princeton University, presently teaches at the University of California in Santa Barbara, but who also is the United Nations rapporteur for Palestine and the occupied territories. So, Richard, please give us your...
My very warm greetings to this very distinguished audience. Let me also take the opportunity to express my deep appreciation to the conveners of this quite extraordinary conference. Extraordinary not only because it brings together people from so many different backgrounds, but also because it has sustained itself over this period of 10 years, and I gather looks forward to another decade. And that is very significant, it seems to me, if one is to really believe in the ethos of dialogue, because it has to be a process, not an event. And I think the Rhodes Forum has started down that kind of path. It's a particular pleasure and honor to speak at the same panel that my dear and old friends Chandra Mazaffa just spoke and Fred Dalmaya is moderating. It does leave me, though, with a small curse because I'm speaking after lunch, which is always a challenge to keep at least half the audience awake, and a big curse, which is to speak after Chandra. But that, I suppose, is my unhappy destiny. Let me precede my remarks about a new geopolitics by making two more or less irreverent remarks about how to think about this dialogic approach to political transformation. I think I would hope in the next decade that the Rhodes Forum would make the transition from what I would call the horizontal dimensions of dialogue to the vertical dimensions of dialogue. And what I mean by that is, it is, of course, important for eminent people in different civilizational and religious orientations to be speaking to one another. But it may be as important or more important for the participation of excluded voices. We need to begin to listen to the youth, to oppressed peoples, to those whose voices are typically not heard in gatherings of this sort. And so I think this sense of what a vertically conceived dialogic process would involve. Also, representatives of indigenous people deserve, especially in this ecologically challenged time, to be heard and to be listened to in a way that is not characteristic of the manner in which the world's elites deal with those who have been marginalized and oppressed. The second irreverent suggestion that I would make is the importance, because of the urgency of some of the challenges facing humanity, that one move toward a politics of dialogue. It is not enough, it seems to me, to talk to one another. One has to imagine political projects that can move the dialogic into the life world of change and struggle. So I would precede my remarks, which are very complementary, I think, to what Chandra just has so eloquently described as a post-hegemonic world. I want to contrast what I call the old geopolitics, which is based on the primacy of hard power, essentially military power, as the essential agent of historical change, with a emerging, but yet not emergent, new geopolitics that rests on soft power, that understands the limits of the role of force in achieving the ends of people and the ends of states. And all of this transition, which I regard as indispensable from an old geopolitics to a new geopolitics, has to include the enlarging of the political imagination of leaders and of citizens from the notion that what is most important is the national interest to a sense of what is part of the national interest, which is fulfilling the global interest and the human interest. Without that enlargement of the political imagination, the problems that beset the planet at the present time will not be resolved. The current leadership, particularly of the dominant countries, continues to be enmeshed in a dysfunctional ideology of realism, which is premised on the effectiveness and necessity for relying on hard power in order to promote the ends of political communities. And if we look around at the issues that confront the world, starting with climate change, we see the inability of either states on their own or states operating within the framework of the United Nations to address the problem in a manner that responds to the most urgent warnings the world has ever received from the scientific community and from a consensus that has rarely existed among scientists. We pride ourselves on being a scientific civilization, and yet we don't heed these warnings when they collide with perceived national and private sector interests. And that is a very dangerous failure to live up to the challenges that are increasingly confronting the world. At the opposite end of in a sense, climate change is at the most globally oriented end of the policy agenda. At the other end of the policy agenda is the kind of interference without constructive results that is exhibited by the response to the bloody conflict in Syria, and to some extent the earlier conflict in Libya. In other words, the world community lacks the wisdom and capacity to address the issues of the day at either end of the pole, either within states or on a global scale. And there's no prospect, I believe, that a world structured as ours is will have that capacity in the foreseeable future without some major shift in political consciousness. And hopefully that major shift can come about through the voluntary emergence of a wiser public and a wiser leadership, and not through the traumatic shock of some kind of catastrophic breakdown. We see the also in terms of the failures of the old geopolitics, the helplessness of the world community to address the ordeal of the Palestinian people that has lasted now ever since 1948. And the Palestinians in their occupied territory, which is 22% of historic Palestine, have endured this stateless condition of occupation, an oppressive occupation, for more than 45 years. And because of the old geopolitics and the way in which American hegemony operates, there is no capacity to address this litmus test of human suffering and the indication of the inability of the world system to promote minimal justice. Despite this generally bleak view of the existing landscape, the existing global landscape, I too believe that a new geopolitics is struggling to be born. It is a global politics that will incorporate by stages the human interest and make our understanding of what it means to be a citizen of a political community have a existential planetary dimension and not be confined to the geographic space of sovereign states. But what we have been witnessing, and what Chandra also called our attention to, is the extent to which a new series of political actors are emerging around the world, China being the most spectacular example, that have risen not as in the old politics through hard power, but as an exemplary case of soft power success, almost success beyond our capacity to comprehend it. Such has been the extraordinary rate of economic progress, modernization, and so on that has occurred in China. And also other countries, many other countries, Brazil, India are the most leading examples of this. Russia has the opportunity to be part of this group that can rise to global preeminence through soft power. And there is more to this argument than the fact that these states have emerged without relying on more than a minimal defensive capability to deal with their immediate territorial border disputes, as is in the case of China and India particularly. What hasn't been noticed, incredibly in my view, but is of potentially immense importance, is the declining capability of hard power to achieve its goals. If we think first about the collapse of colonialism, in which in all these instances, perhaps most remarkably in India, the stronger side, from a hard power perspective, didn't control the outcome. History was shaped by the weaker side militarily. The collapse of the Soviet system is another example where an internal set of contradictions led to a completely unanticipated change of momentous historical importance. The collapse of apartheid in South Africa through a global anti-apartheid campaign that rested on moral disapproval, essentially, reinforced by such means as boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. The recent upheavals in the Arab world, known to us as the Arab Spring, again suggested the impotence of hard power as a means of permanently oppressing people. And that it's more general than this. If one looks at these international conflicts, we see over and over again the failure of hard power, military superiority to control political outcomes. The Soviet Union failed in Afghanistan, as did the United States. Prior to that, and most significantly in my view, the United States could not prevail in Vietnam. It was defeated in Vietnam despite winning every battle in the war. Two military people on either side of the conflict spoke after the war, and the American Colonel Summers said, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." And the Vietnamese colonel responded, "Yes, you are correct, but it is irrelevant." Now, understanding that irrelevance is the key to understanding the declining role of hard power as an agent of historical change and historical control. And we've had repetition of this failure. Trillions of dollars spent in the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan. And the war in Iraq had the result of, who was the winner of the war of Iraq? It's generally agreed it was Iran. You know, hardly the result planned by Washington. In Afghanistan, one doesn't know what will happen in the aftermath of this conflict, but what's clear is that the vision of what Afghanistan should be like, that was held in the White House by successive presidents, is certain not to be actualized in history. So what we see is, over and over again, military power cannot gain political outcomes, yet the reliance on it is a large part of what makes Chandra's assessment of the decline of the United States as a hegemonic power come to fruition. It is, and there are no signs that the United States is capable of learning from failure, which is one of the most discouraging aspects of this whole picture. It's marching toward an encounter now with Iran, which would be a crazy, perhaps the craziest of all of these violent efforts to hold back the tides of history. And we must ask, why is it incapable of learning from failure? Why does each failure lead to a reformulation of its military intervention doctrine and the search for new technological weapons? The new one is the drone, of course, that is supposed to be to change the balance of forces and allow military power again to become a rational instrument of foreign policy. But it is the degree to which the governing process in the United States has itself become militarized. It has too long been a war economy. It has too long been preoccupied with enemies, World War II, then the Cold War, and then the War on Terror. All of these have given new credibility internally to a militarized blinkering of the political and moral imagination, not capable of thinking outside the military box. And we see this in the context of the Iranian encounter. Clearly, the logical, reasonable solution would be for the United States to use its leverage to get rid of nuclear weapons in the entire region. What would make more sense than a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East? And yet it is paralyzed even to mention it, partly because of this militarization of the imagination, and partly to the degree to which Israel is capable of vetoing the most sensible, rational course of foreign policy if it doesn't happen to coincide with their perceptions of what they would like to see happen in the region. This is a very peculiar expression of declining hegemony, where a secondary state is able, through its political leverage, to manipulate the approach taken by the supposed dominant political actor on the world scene. So what I'm really trying to express overall is that we have a remarkable opportunity to move toward a nonviolent geopolitics. I think it is clear to the leadership of countries like China and Japan, Germany, India, Brazil, that the road toward their success is a road that avoids war. And one of the achievements of the European Union that hasn't been very well acknowledged is the degree to which an internal culture of peace has been at least provisionally established. It isn't an external culture of peace, as their enthusiasm for the Libyan intervention made evident. But I think that this experience of the last 75 years, in which hard power has not only shown how much suffering is generated by reliance upon it, but also that it's ineffective historically and politically, and actually harms those that rely upon it. If that lesson can somehow be incorporated into the thinking of those that are influential in this overall dialogic process that I think is so important in producing a understanding that there is a tangible, concrete human interest that must gradually displace the preoccupation with national interest. And we need to educate our peoples to understand that global citizenship is the only sensible way of being a member of any political community. And global citizenship not only in terms of the geography of the planet, but also its future. The debt to future generations involves a citizenship that has a temporal dimension as well as a spatial one. So we have this incredible opportunity at this point in human history, but we also face a ticking clock. Whether that ticking clock is associated with climate change or associated with nuclear weapons that could destroy human civilization in a matter of minutes. It's a very precarious way to organize security. And so the challenge at the end is, how can the human species awaken to the danger and to the opportunity to overcome it? And I feel that's the core of any kind of dialogic preoccupation with global justice. Thank you very much.